So I think out of all the books that come your way, Poor Economics for Kids is possibly the only book that has made me understand economics in many ways. Usually you see economics in a title and you don't want to pick it up, at least for me. And I wanted to ask you, you started, I read somewhere where, with the idea of writing this book for children, and you said that when you were growing up as a kid, about 8 or 9 in France, you were obsessed with poverty. Can you talk a little bit about that? The inspiration for writing the book and your obsession with poverty and what it sort of taught you about Calcutta, in a way.
Good morning, everyone. So glad to be here. So indeed, when I grew up, both due to my... So I grew up in a very middle-class neighborhood in a suburb of Paris with all of the comfort of middle-class life, but my mom was a pediatrician and she was very involved in NGOs that help kids victims of wars around the world. So due to this, I was exposed relatively early on to the idea that there are kids who live very different lives. And I was also fortunate to have very many books around me, including books, and particularly because my mother was keen that we had those kind of books, particularly books and comics and magazines that had stories about poverty. And it's in one of these books that I found my first story about Calcutta and about Mother Teresa and it said that people in Calcutta had 1 square meter each to sleep. So I imagined at that time that the square meter had to be a square of 1 by 1 by 1, and I was wondering how people would fit in and whether they had to be crouching like that in fetal position to fit on their corner. When someone kindly pointed out to me that it could also be 50 centimeters by 2 meters, that also makes 1 square meter, then I thought it would be much better. And I imagined people aligned like sardines on the pavement of Calcutta. And when I first went to Calcutta, Calcutta is the first Indian city that I visited, and I fell in love with that city immediately. And I was totally dispelled of this because, of course, you travel in the cab and you see people going about their business and nobody is actually sleeping in the street, or some people are, but not that many. And there are, houses and cars and people doing, in fact, many things in the street, but because that's pleasant and comfortable in Calcutta. So I'm telling this story because it really illustrates 2 things about kids, books for kids, which made me really want to write a book for kids one day. The first one is the importance that books for kids had for me. Like these books that you read as kids, they stay with you for a very long time. There's these images of this Mother Teresa comic book. They are still with me, as long as many other books that I read at the time, and they decided my life. Because at that time I thought, I'm so lucky to be born where I'm born. And that gives me a sort of cosmic responsibility to the world that I will find a way to discharge someday. And that happens through books. And the second thing is that this book was quite terrible in a way, because it was conveying all these prejudices about what is poverty and life in India, and gave, I think, a pretty dismal vision also of what Mother Teresa's work was, like totally wrong. And so that really gave me, from that moment, actually, I wanted to one day write for, first of all, make a difference in the lives of people, and second, write for kids. So I started with 1, that was a bit easier, and then when I had enough experience in me, I could move to 2. So this is why finally I got to write this book.
And the book wouldn't be possible without the illustrations, and I think what really does this book, if you look at Poor Economics for Children and you talk about poverty in India, whether it is, you talk about growing up in France and having this stereotype of poverty, but if you look in India where you cannot escape it, there is a stereotype of poverty too, in the sense it's very difficult to escape. And for children it sort of becomes, how do you have that difficult conversation? But what really, really brings the book alive is the illustrations. They're incredible. Can I hold them out? Do you think it's nice for people to see?
Sure, please.
On the screen? I don't know whether they can see on the screen, but okay, this is... Oh, sorry, there, sorry. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay, can you see? Right? And there is, and I'm going to show you some more. This is one of my favorite illustrations, as well as one of my favorite chapters in the book. Nessa goes to a big city and tries to find a job. And most of us, here goes back. Here, can you see it? Yeah. So this is a chapter which talks about COVID. It talks about migration. It talks about relationship with home. It's a beautifully illustrated this thing. But can you talk really about illustrating in a way that it is a book which is for India but also universal? And how did you go around illustrating it?
So I guess that was one of my first questions to Esther when she reached out to me for making this book. She sent me the first stories, and one of the first questions I asked is, where is it set? Because as an illustrator, I need to get references, I need to know what kind of costumes people wear, what kind of places to draw, what kind of vegetation, etc. So I need to know if it is located in India, then I'll go look for images and then I build mine out of that. And the first thing that Esther said is that the village in which the stories are placed should not be placed anywhere identifiable. You would think that they are happening in India or in Africa or in South America. And that is, for a reason she'll explain, but as an illustrator, it poses you a huge dilemma, which is how do you therefore build a world that kids will want to go back to? And this world has to have enough details, have to have enough complexity for the kids to want to read it again and again and again. So I guess what we decided, and what was also part of my existing visual vocabulary, is that it should be a bit irrealistic. You'll see the characters don't have natural skin tones. There are purple characters, pink characters, yellow characters. The colors are very vibrant. It's very stylized, and we wanted this aesthetic to confuse people. And the references are a bit picked from all around the world. And I guess the reason for that aesthetic, Esther will...
Do you want to talk about why you chose to have this sort of very diverse aesthetic?
Yeah, a lot of our work with Abhijit Banerjee and also with the Poverty Action Lab, which I co-founded 20 years ago now, is really about problems of poverty that are universal, that you find in many places. In fact, also sometimes in the richer countries, the context might be different, but some of the psychological and market-based phenomena are very similar across places. There are also aspects, of course, of the lives of every individual, rich and poor, that are very culturally specific, but there are many that are universal, and our work is more on the latter. So what I wanted to do in these books is to write stories that could be understood by anyone living in this environment, and also could represent for people who do not live in this environment, French kids, Indian kids from upper middle class who are probably never going to a village or not very frequently. I wanted them to see those issues, to see the people as, in some sense, very, very similar to them, even though they're facing different problems. And for that, not locating in a particular culture was critical. So another thing we did, for example, is the names are a little bit all over the place. Some are Indian names, some are Middle Eastern names, some are totally made up, and some are from Swahili, etc. And in fact, we had the discussions with Chiki Sarkar, Indian publisher, who said, don't you want to change the name for the Indian market? They look a bit Star Trek. And I was like, no, we'll go with Star Trek, that's fine. And then she was like, okay, that I see the point. And that's so they all have these very different names, and not only in English, but in Indian languages, since they are published in 6 other Indian languages, regional languages, and distributed very widely by Pratham Books, to whom we are very grateful, in schools all over the place, which is, I think, also something we wanted from the beginning. And locating it in this universal, empathetic place was critical to this.
So, I'm going to sort of, I know I should have done this possibly before, I think, is that to sort of talk about a little bit about the book so that everybody kind of goes and grabs it, because I think it is not only about children. I think that when you look at poverty and you try and tell a story through statistics, and I know as a journalist, it's, the idea is humanized, right? It's an important story, but how do you sort of tell it with sort of fleshing it out. But I don't think we kind of get it as much as they do. They really have empathy. And I think what is also wonderful about the book is that there are 10 stories, and it's about 10 different circumstances. So there is one which is about a natural disaster. There's Afia who gets sick. It talks about malaria. It talks about mosquitoes. There's Nesbo's story when he goes out to migration, and the COVID one, which is one of my favorite. But there are various aspects of these people's lives, and it is about, I think what it does, and especially for children, is that it's challenges that everybody faces every day, so it doesn't make it different from anybody else, but there's also a certain level of empathy. And what I found fascinating was that they do have an inner world for each character. So for example, when Afia, who's one character who gets sick, she goes to, this person who is like a doctor, not a doctor, but in the village, and she prescribes her antibiotic, and the story, and she in her head they're thinking that, oh my God, if I don't prescribe that antibiotic, she may or may not need it, but if I don't, then people will stop coming to me. They'll have lost faith in me. So I think there is a certain aspect of humanizing in the inner world. And can you really talk about how you created that inner world and the kind of aspect of sort of giving each character this empathy as well as this inner life, which doesn't make them only black and white or evil?
So I guess there are many things in the book that contribute to that aspect. First, the fact that it's a series. It's not just one book on poverty. And I guess with one book, you can very quickly go in a miserabilistic tone, but you cannot do that for 10 books. It's unbearable for the reader. It's unbearable for the author. So having 10 books allows you to, for example, in the first book, the teacher is a bit of a bad character. It's not really pleasant, but gradually in the other books, she becomes more and more helpful. The kids start to like her, etc. Yeah. So you can also bring in that complexity in the characters over time. Another thing that we thought was that the characters or the universe could not just be a token for talking about the important topic of poverty. That's not how you bring kids to get interested in the characters, that they should have a life of their own, that Nilu gets angry at her mom because she drags her at school, and that this is something that the kids all over the world will relate to. And their interaction, the fact that it's not, every single scene of the book is not just about a problem that they face. They also invite each other for tea, they go to see another of their friends, they fight with each other, and that's the whole flesh of the universe, which makes that the children will also want to go to those characters because they feel they are as complex and interesting as them, and they face problems that they will therefore get interested in. I guess a third thing that we really wanted to do was to bring a voice to every character, because it's a series, there are over 50 characters, and we wanted, regularly you'll see that in the pages there are full face of every single character, and they'll say something about what they think the others should think, or their expression, their wonders, etc. And we felt that this was a way to give contradictory voices to the kids. For example, at some point, we show the insurance person explaining why he does not want to insure the characters. And he's a bit of a bad character, but you hear what he has to say. And it makes, I guess it makes the child reader think for himself rather than being given a straight response.
So you developed this book when you said you always wanted to write for children, and then your children were also part of the process. In some ways, they were guinea pigs to this whole thing. Can you talk about that? The sort of almost having, essentially having been able to test this out before you sent it out into the world.
Yes. So. First of all, I would say add one thing, so there are 50 characters in the book and a certain number of children, their family, and from reading the books, you get to know them, but you will never get to know them as well as we know them. We know so many things about them. You can come and ask, what they're doing in between the books, as well as our French publisher. They're our friends, these kids. They are wonderful, they are feisty, they are not perfect, they make a lot of good decisions, bad decisions. So the empathy is not something that we work on. This is something that we just, in the course of writing 10 books, you get to know these people very well. Particularly because they started, so I've had this dream, like literally since I was a kid. And then when we finished Poor Economics with Abhijit, I really wanted to write something for kids from then on, but we had another book in our system, so we had to do that first. And it only could be possible once I met Cheyenne, because I had, as you said before, I had to have someone, I had to have the perfect illustrator, and she was that person. But we kind of talked about it, and we were going to do it, and so on, and then COVID struck. And we found ourselves cooped up together because she was living with us at the time. And we were kind of all in children, parents, etc. And then that's when we really started to get into this project, into this universe, and writing the first stories. And my daughter, Noemi, she was 8 at the time, and she read the books, and she would take appointments with Cheyenne to discuss the list of issues and what is not correct. And this was really extraordinarily helpful because children read with a different level of focus than adults. And that's true for children readers, particularly because of this coming back to the story and again and again and again and again. And it's also true, maybe Cheyenne can give some example of what kids will pay attention to that might pass over an adult.
I think what was pleasant was the fact that we worked together back and forth all the time at all steps of the book. It was not a work process in which Esther would hand me over the finished stories, and then I would illustrate it on my own and then send it to her, and this would done. She would send me one page of a story, and then I would make the storyboard out of it and send it back to her, and then she would make comments, etc. So we did this back and forth many times, and I think this is what allowed for putting a lot of meaning into the illustrations. And I can give you an example where I realized I had strong visual prejudices about the representation of the poor. For example, I think on the 3rd page of the first book, the main character, Nilou, is going to school, and she's going to school alone. And the first thing that I write as a proposed text under comes from, I think, my own references growing up in France as a kid, learning about poor children in the world, is that the school is very far away, and she almost has to climb a mountain to go there. So I write something in that sense, thinking that it does not matter so much. And I send it to Esther in this first draft versions, and she immediately stops me saying, no, this is something that we actually talk about in Poor Economics. This is wrong, and this would be wrong to say that. And so I think starting with this first somehow misstart, we realized that every single detail in the image and in the text mattered, because the kids they are much better than us as adults to read images and to actually read what they have in front of them. We read it through so many lenses that we forget what we are actually presented, but they will take it for what it is, and they will question it, but they will start out of that. So we realized that we should be infinitely careful about every single thing that we put in the books.
So, you talked about the first this Nilou goes to school, right? And I wanted to talk about that. You've chosen 10 different things. So my first question would be that why were these 10 problems chosen? How did you choose these as an introduction to the sort of but the challenged sort of nuanced world of poverty, which you're going to introduce the kids to?
Yeah, so by and large, these are the chapters of Poor Economics, so the topics that we feel are very important in the life of everyone, so education, health, migration and finding jobs, nutrition, politics, gender empowerment, or lack thereof, and with maybe a disaster, coping with risks and so on. So these are kind of the central themes in most of our work, and today was very logically the chapters for this series. With one maybe distinction relative to poor economics, which is there is more insistence in these books about the relationship with the environment, because poor economics is now 15 years old, and we kind of realize that there is a big environment-shaped hole in poor economics. We don't have a chapter that is devoted to climate or to the environment, because it was 15 years ago and we didn't see it coming. So where these books have three chapters that have kind of direct references. One is really the heat wave and cutting trees. One is about water shortage and the importance of diversifying agriculture. And one is about the disaster cyclone.
So, there is this aspect of the city, the relationship with the city, and I'm going back to that story because I think it is, in some ways, it also clarifies the idea of why people migrate. And, you've got this list of questions at the end of it, as to why, the experiment that was done like a scientist, as to why these people migrate to a city. And I think that one of the biggest fallacies, as well as the biggest stereotype all of us grow up with, is the idea that, everybody wants to migrate to the city because they have better facilities, right? That's how we see it. As to, the opportunities are better in the city, and everybody just wants to leave the village and come to the city because that's where the jobs are. But the story really tells you about the relationship that they do have at home, and most people do not necessarily want to move this. You want to talk a little bit about that, about illustrating that, as well as how do you sort of the difference between the city and how you sort of also illustrate intimate spaces at home, and there is a different lens, there is a different, I'm not saying color, but there is a different way that you look at that. And can you talk a little bit about that?
So I think we tried to make the main story is happening in a village, and the city is somehow a resource space. It's at the center of the third book, but people go back to it in many of the books. But we wanted to show a nuanced version of it. We didn't want to show a city versus countryside, so the countryside being ideal, being a bit Eden-like. We also wanted to show how difficult it was for many reasons, but also how pleasant it was for many reasons, that the family was there, that he was still close to nature, but it was not that ideal. It wasn't
utopia.
It was not also in utopia. And I guess maybe I see that seeing what is available in France, where the picture books on poverty are overwhelmingly happening in the city. And the city is very much linked to poverty. And there is very, very little about how poverty also happens in the countryside. So that's something, I guess, talking to the French reader is something that they rarely envision, because in many picture books in France, the countryside is very much the place to replenish, an ideal place. You go to the lake, you go to the countryside house.
Instagram pictures, basically.
Exactly. So I think we wanted to, and in the third story, we basically embodied this into two characters who are two best friends. Yes. And one really wants to go to the city, he wants to make money there, he wants to make a new life. And the other one really doesn't want, he's afraid. And over the story, they basically changed their mind, because the first one went, but eventually he didn't see his family anymore. He was badly treated. He had to sleep on the construction site, so he's afraid and wants to go back. And the other one, on the other hand, finds love in the city and thinks it's finally attractive. So I think the division or the change is also embodied by those two characters and how their feelings change really in relation to the city.
Do you want to talk about the relationship between the city and this?
Yeah, one of the thing that happening in this book is that so one of the in our second book, Good Economics for Hard Time, we discuss migration, and we discuss how people do not generally go to the city just because they are looking for higher wages. They really leave home when they have to. And there is this wonderful poem by Waisher Ali who is talking about you only leave home when home will not have you anymore. And in fact, we just came back from the Sundarban, where we spoke to many people, and many are now migrated, since, in particular, after the Ayla cyclone. And it's exactly what they told us. A lot of them are migrating, usually back and forth temporarily, sometimes the whole family, sometimes one person. But they all tell us about how that's, it's not a choice. It's the fact that the way that they're living their life is gone, is destroyed. They can't do agriculture because the water has salinated the field. They can't go in the forest anymore because that's restricted. So there's nothing left but going. So this is in the book. Although the book was written before, it was kind of illustrate very much this story. And in the book, the way this is reflected is by this reluctant character. He only goes when his grandmother is so weak out of lack of food in the house that he feels, and in fact his parents are pushing him and said, she's gonna die, you have to bring some money home. And that's what it takes this, that's when he takes his journey for the first time. And you can see that even before, so Cheyenne was talking about trying to not be idyllic. He works on the trash pile in the village, sorting the trash. So this, which is what a lot of people do, and it's not represented as something repulsive. It just happens to be what it does. But it's not also the paradise near the lake. And on the contrary, the city. It was very joyful. In fact, there is a lot of things in this book where we are playing with the code of children literature. So all children love construction sites, girls and boys, and the things on construction site happens to be that many of the migrants work on construction sites. So we could really have a ball with the construction site in the city. In the same way that in other places we have a ball with the forest, which is another trope of the children's book.
You talked about the idea of, of course, we've talked about the nuanced world of people who have sort of live up evil in a way, but there's also an aspect of about Star Trek names as well as superhero kids, right? So there is this, in the natural disaster story, there is the insurer who refuses to give the money for insurance because he says, basically, you're not insured for this, and while he's not depicted as an evil man, there was a discussion between the child almost saving the world and sort of writing this letter and then getting the government to respond and sort of saving this, but you chose not to do that. Can you talk about the idea of superhero children, and then Esther, can you respond to that?
So I guess the series is always about one character. Each story is about one specific character, but very quickly you realize that it's about his group of friends, and eventually it's about the whole village. So in many of the stories, the collective of the village is always important. They'll go, for example, in the story which features the forest, they go look at the grandmother, and the grandmother tells the story of when she was young, they fought to keep the trees. Or they'll go find out the very, very poor woman at the edge of the village, which they think is a witch, and eventually they get to know her better. She becomes a regular character. For example, I think this thing of the individual versus the collective, we thought about it very much in the election book. Yeah. And at the end, the first version of the story was that it's a book about women in politics. And the first version of the story was that at the end, the main character's mother wins the election. And the last picture showed her celebrating the election with the kids and with her husband and the village. And we reread it, and we felt that this was the wrong ending, that we didn't want it to show that she was celebrating her own victory. So we decided to get rid of this ending and to show to add another image to show the villagers discussing what kind of politics they would like, what kind of policies they would be interested in, and which candidate could fit better. And since those are very short stories, it's only 32 pages, so you really have to use them wisely, and every single scene means something, has really earned its place in the book.
To kind of go back to your to the example on the insurance, so the first scenario I'd written for the story was, what happened in the story is that they have this this house on a lake, and then there is a hurricane, and the house is taken away, and the boat that they had purchased after savings for years get taken away as well. Which, by the way, again, from our Sundarban trip, we met a family to which this exactly happened. They had a house, their house was swept away, and their boat was swept away. So it was a little bit heart-wrenching, given that we had illustrated their story before. In any case, these people in the book, they have insurance. They go and ask the insurer, and the insurer said, no, you are insured for drought, but not for floods. Which is something that, you know, might sound familiar. There is a lot of holes in the insurance product. And then we have him explain why, etc. But the kids decide that they are not going to take this for an answer, and they write a letter, in fact, with the help of the teacher, who now becomes an enabler in the books. And in the first scenario, that letter comes in, it's published in the newspaper, and that makes the insurers give in. And Abhijit read the first story and was like, no, that's not how it happens. You know, if it's not insured, it's not insured. You cannot, like, make it. But on the other hand, what would happen in the real world is that at the end of the day, in India and elsewhere in the world, it's the government that steps in and is the insurer of last resort for many of these circumstances. And in a situation like a hurricane, there is going to be a disaster declaration, and people will get some amount of compensation from that. So we decided to present that. And maybe that's, you know, it doesn't have the very simple arc that you would have in most of kids' books, where the kids arrive, they do something, they solve the problem, full stop. It reopens on this, you know, the government is actually, you know, and representing the government in the kids' book is another thing that you can talk about. It's kind of a little bit unusual, so we had to figure out the right codes, again, that would work across countries and culture. But it's the government that solves the problem, which is true, which really is fidel to reality, and also reopens. And in a lot of our endings, we are trying to do that, to not have full closure, but to have reopening for people, for kids, for readers, for parents, for anyone who comes across these books, to think more at the end, rather than being told, well, this is your answer. Another thing that is very important is that it is not true that kids alone can save the world and so on and so forth. We hear it a lot about climate change. This generation will need to undo everything we did. Well, no, we are not going to do that all on their own. They can only do that together, and it's not fair. And it's stressful for kids, I think, to be told that everything rests on them. And it's not fair, because it's not that they can, but as part of a collective and inscribed in the tradition, then they can. So that comes up in the insurance book, where eventually that's the government that comes in, but they got, you know, the government is made aware of the government knew about the things, but the villagers are made aware that there is this solution because the letter comes in. So the kids have had a role, but they've had a role that is at the place of a normal kid, not a superhero child.
Yeah. Just to pick up on that, that's something that we realized doing the book, which was that when you build characters, you often build characters out of existing characters, and you build them out of the existing characters in children's literature, where I guess you can find, I don't know, many bakers, the fishermen. There are specific, or the school teachers. There are many characters that exist, but we needed characters that don't really exist, such as a government worker or an NGO worker. There is, for example, in the fifth story, this old woman, this old witch, she needs help, and she needs help at that very intermediate level. And on one scene, I remember that we really stepped on it, and not knowing how to call that person, because there was not a given name for that person, which is just not even a main person. It was just an intermediary who comes to this woman and asks her what does she want to do and how they can help her. And we didn't know a word that would be recognized by children.
Across the world, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And which leads to, and in this story, we particularly wondered also about the kind of agency that the characters have. Again, Abhijit reread all the versions of the book, and for this particular story, what he told us was that this woman does not have much agency. She's being given a sewing machine, and she just obeys what the government person says. And he told us that she should have more agency. She should be a bit reluctant. Why are you making me do this thing? And so then we tried to give her more agency to show that she's not just a passive recipient of something that happens to her, and she just does it. So that's something which is very important in making characters in a book about poverty.
But I'll tell you a funny story about my prejudices and about government worker. So the first time we have a government worker, I wrote something that he was very round. And Cheyenne was like, how do you know that all government workers are very round? And I had this image of the babu going to So finally we made him lanky because it was unfair to call that all the government workers are very round. That was a total prejudices that I was kind of, happily sneaking into a kid's book that, especially since they don't have so much other images would have been particularly damaging. So that is one example that of the prejudices coming at you when you're not paying attention.
So you've had various people write to you or tell you, right? And you knew that the story has worked. Can you tell me about a couple of this thing? I know somebody talked about a witch, but has there been any other feedback that children have given you, which kind of makes you understand that they do and that that the book has actually worked, that they don't see poor people as this large nameless crowd, unwashed masses? Would you like
so I did many workshops with children in France out of those books. So I think it's very hard to assess if a book works or not because it's not that mechanical, and you cannot. Yeah. It's very hard. What I would say is that we had different responses. I did workshop with children 14 years old, 15 years old, who could get something about the poverty. They had discussed it with their teachers. They had many, many questions. A lot of the time, the best questions that we ever had on the books. Much better than many journalists. That was great. Except for you, but they really had. I think they are not bothered by the whole vocabulary that adults put around poverty. Yeah. So they go very straight to the point. And I think the much younger children, 6 years old, will just talk to me about the trees, about the characters, about the fact that they were sad that she got sick. So I think that in some sense, that fit our purpose because we really wanted the kids to get along with the characters first and then wonder about the topic and the issues. What we realized in a radio show with French kids was that they had somehow even worse prejudices than we thought. So many kids in France asked us, why are the poor in your book happy? Why are they clean? Why do they have houses? So they asked very, very basic questions which made us think that it was worth doing the book because it would answer many, many questions that they had or didn't have on poverty in the world.
Would you like to answer?
So we got an email from a class. They had read the Tumpa book about the trees, and they had a lot of comments. They didn't like it. I mean, I think they liked it, but they didn't like what we were trying to convey. They had a lot of opinions about...
As they should, all children, unfortunately.
About how, because it ends with... so these particular books, the kids first stopped the trees to being cut, but then the reason why the villagers had wanted the trees to be cut is because they had... all the harvest had failed, and that problem is still with them, so they need to figure a solution, and the solution that is brought in is this idea of paying people for conservation. So it's called payment for ecosystem services in the jargon. And so we explain how that works. So the kids had a lot of opinions that it wasn't right or what, I don't agree with these opinions, but I'm glad that they brought them forward.
Yeah, and started talking about it because I think that's the thing. Now, my last question, I think that there was a certain hesitation. You've talked about prejudice about children, but there's also a certain prejudice about you said that there was a certain hesitation about buying the book necessarily for French. This thing that French parents thought, and I'm sure it is the same as Indian, thought that thought that it would lead to maybe uncomfortable questions. Can you talk a little bit about the prejudice that parents had while going out and buying the book too?
So with parents, so our French publisher, so our initial idea was that the stories had to be there on their own. There are several voices in the story. There is a narrative voices which is calm and has some explanation in it of what's happening. There are the people who are thinking, who give further explanation to their own thought process, and then there is the language in the bubble. That's kind of the life of the place. And we thought this would be enough to make our point, and the story needed to live on their own. We were not writing. It's not non-fiction. It's fiction. Our French publisher believed that for French parents, because French parents would be intimidated in presenting these issues to their children because they wouldn't feel equipped to answer their questions. And therefore, they needed a text for them. So in the French edition, at the end of this is sold as 10 separate books, and at the end of each book, there is a lengthy essay where it's not that I explain everything, but I put it in context to help them. When we brought out the Indian edition, Chikisakar said that she was envisioning it for kids, not for parents, for slightly older kids who would read it themselves in order to, so she envisioned, I think, a kid in a relatively affluent neighborhood for whom this is relatively far away. And then they thought the kids needed mediation, but written in their own language, which is what they are essays which are targeted to kids. Again, the idea is not to explain frame by frame like you have in some non-fiction book, which is horrendous, but to give some little perspective or some story which is somewhat dimly related or something like refer to my own life. For example, I took in the last book. The last book is about Nilu. She wants to be a truck driver, and everybody thinks that's not a job for a girl, and they're all trying to convince her why she shouldn't do that. And I explain in the book that as I grew up, I wanted to be a boy because I thought that only boys had opportunities. And so these type of things are there for the English essays. And then the Indian languages version, the regional languages versions, Pratham thinks of them for 8 to 9-year-old readers as stories and felt they don't need any explanation, they'll get it. And then, so finally, in a sense, it's in the Pratham version that it's in our original, it's an original intent, which is the story live for themselves. But it's quite wonderful that people, different publishers have thought that it worked for different public with, the most scaffolding for the parents in France, a little less scaffolding for the kids in India, and no scaffolding at all for the young reader in all of the languages.
To add on that, on the parents being scared to buy a book on poverty for their children, that's something that we also thought very much while doing the stories. We, for example, in the book about education, there is a scene where, in reality, from the studies, the parents start to beat up the children because they realize that they are not learning in school. And we wondered, should we show that? And we decided not to, because this would defeat the purpose, because the young kids would fixate on this violent scene rather than fixate on what is really important. Or there are other instances where when we show the grandmother being so sick that she cannot get up, the publisher asked me, do you think the kids will think she's dead already? Yeah. Or, for example, is the old woman too scary? So we thought about this all throughout the books. Is this too violent? Are we trying to cover up the reality? Are we showing it in the right way? And does this serve our purpose? So I think throughout the book it's pretty much balanced, which makes that it's not just a series of harsh scenes. Yeah. This could not be.
Thank you. So we have 1 minute and one question. So I'm going with the lady because my preference. Gender equality. Yep. Quickly. Just loudly. Buland awaz. Yeah, you can. Here's the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Soumya Mathur, and I have read your book with my daughter, and it has sparked really important conversations about inequality and responsibility. So, as an educator, my question to you was, I wanted to know your perspective in terms of how we can introduce this concept of the perception of poverty, social responsibility in the classroom to a wider audience.
We certainly hope that the books can be helpful to do that. I think they will be needed to be appropriated by each and every educator in their lesson plans. They can take some chapter, not some chapter, but we really hope that the books can serve this purpose. And we're glad to hear that you have the same view. One of the things that Cheyenne makes kids do is to redraw, to draw new images. And that's also a way of kind of getting them to talk about, how they decide to represent it differently. In one of the workshops, they invented new endings to the story because they didn't like the ending the way it was. And that's so you can, embed art and you can embed thinking about, but also all the social science thinking that kids will have into why it goes this way and what else could have happened. So I think kind of incorporating this more as from the story perspective can be super successful and has been in workshops.